Hey everybody, this is Anne and welcome back to Painting Big. Today we are going to cover metallics. Just a quick fundamentals video for you. So we're going to talk about what is a metallic paint, what's the stuff they put in it to make it shiny, what does that mean for you, what are its properties, what happens on different palettes, can you thin it without it dying, things like that. Alright, let's get to it. Alrighty folks. So metallic paints, some people love them, some people hate them, some people just don't know how to use them. I personally find that when I'm working on, say I'm working on a big model, I like metallics a lot more. When I'm working on something smaller, I don't like them as much. That's because when you've got a lot of like fine filigree or really fine detail on a model, trying to get that to show up with metallics can be a little challenging. Sometimes it just gets lost in the shine, even if you try to like kind of, shade around it. If it's really fine and really elaborate, then sometimes it just doesn't work. But otherwise, on a chunky orc like this, it's fine. So first of all, what is a metallic paint? All right. So obviously, being who I am, I have some Reaper here. I also have Warpaint Fanatic, the new stuff. There's a fundamental difference between these two. I'll talk about it. So metallic paint is kind of a standard paint base. Usually it'll feature a little bit of a harder paint base, like a more durable one, because usually you want a shinier paint base with your metallics. It'll let the shine look better. So shinier paint bases are usually acrylics or kind of variants on it, like a high acrylic base tends to be more shiny, more durable. Whatever the case, you've got that base, and then you've got whatever safe flow improvers or paint conditioners or whatever else is in there to aid the paint, and then you've got the flake. Now the flake is going to be a different material depending on the manufacturer and the line. With Reaper, we believe in using as non-toxic of a material as we can, so we use mica flake. Now mica flake has some disadvantages, as does the other flake, which is aluminum. There's also silicate flakes, and Reaper uses a couple of those as well, and I'll talk about those briefly. So first off, mica has been used for a flake in the hobby community for ages. Since the dawn of hobby paint, pretty much, it's been mica. For the very reason that it is non-toxic, and it creates a reasonably shiny paint. However, what it doesn't do is cover. And so when aluminum flake came along, a lot of companies now have jumped into the aluminum flake. I think Vallejo started. I think the earliest aluminum flake I had was second earliest. This is the second earliest. The actual earliest that I know of is this old GW stuff. Almost dead sure this is an aluminum flake because it actually covers. So Model Air Chrome and other Vallejo metallics. The Vallejo metal color is aluminum. A lot of the colored metallics now are coated aluminum. So they will give you coverage, which didn't used to happen in the olden days. We'll talk a little bit about pros and cons of that aluminum flake in a little bit. But first, let's take that and say, okay, we've got a base, we've got some sort of flake in it. What's mica, by the way? Mica is rocks, right? It's ground up mica, so it's ground up rocks as opposed to ground up metal. So you've got this ground up substance inside of your base. So, okay, so what does this mean for coverage if you're using a mica flake? Okay, so what this means in general is you want to have a darker base coat before you put down your metallic flake. So if you are trying to work on a white primed model, for example, if you've primed something white, then you're going to want to paint that surface before you put the metallics on it. So I usually use a dark gray, like this is a charcoal gray, it's carbon gray from MSP. It's very close to black. You can also use black for silver flakes. Most often it works fine. I tend to like to go a little bit lighter, but the thing to remember is to use something that's pretty dark. So if you're doing gold, for example, you want to use a dark brown. So you might use something that's like a really dark brown like this, or just a little bit lighter, but not too much so. You could also use a dark red or a dark green with gold. You could use a dark blue with silver. Whether this even matters in aluminum flake paint, it really won't matter because the aluminum flake is going to cover no matter what. So we'll just use the Warpaint's Fanatic for now. And this has fantastic coverage. You can see it's going on pretty smooth. You can use a lot of metallics right out of the bottle, by the way. You don't have to thin them as long as they aren't older or if they've been sitting in your palette for a while. So I can see a little bit of texture when I paint this, but in general, look at that. It's rock solid. So then contrast that with a Reaper color. This is aged pewter. It's the only mica-based silver I had. It's going to be okay, actually, because we're putting it over this dark color. But if I try to put this mica-based metallic down over a lighter color, it's not going to look as solid. Like, look, I can still see the lighter color here. Can you see it? Yeah, you can see that this is a medium color and this is a lighter color. So you can see through it on this lighter color. Whereas on the black here, it's pretty solid. My paint's a little thicker, so I'm getting a little bit of texture here. So you can see the difference in the shine, though, also. Part of that is the color. This one has some pigment in it, and this one doesn't. So the other thing that's going to be in your metallic paints is pigments, right? So base, and then any additives, and then the flake, and then pigments. Now, any pigment that you add to a metallic is going to dim that metallic shine. It's not going to be nearly as shiny. Whereas the closer you are to a pure flake, the shinier the metallic is going to be. This matters when you start adding in shading and trying to do highlights. So in general, you're going to see this pewter one. This has some umber pigment in it and also a little bit of black. You can see that it's not quite as shiny as its friend over here. I said I would talk about silicate flakes a little bit. Reaper does use a silicate flake. I actually added it in while I was in charge of the paint department, not because it covered, because it sure doesn't. But it's the only flake I ever found that I actually could thin without too much separation, and I could actually layer with it. So it's a super fine. Let's see if I can get this on here. So you're going to start seeing right away. Let's get a little closer. You can kind of see through it. See, you're definitely, it's definitely not giving us the coverage of these other flakes. Although it's still plenty shiny, and 2 coats would be fine, I think. I don't know any other company that uses silicate flakes. So it's probably a moot point, unless you're working with... Reaper's silicate metallics would be blade steel, filigree silver, essentially the Bones silver metallics. Now you can see, though, how bright that is. It's excellent in brightness. That one's still the brightest, and it's giving you that because of the coverage. This one looks a little weak right now. You can see that it's quite bright over that mid-gray. So you may have to experiment a little bit to see what background color works best for you as far as the metallic you're using, the color you're using, and the type you're using. Okay, so thinning. I wanted to talk about thinning and palettes. So what does this all mean? All this flake suspended in goop, you know, with pigment added to it. What does this mean for palettes? Now, y'all know I'm a well palette user, and so I ended up doing this. For a well palette, be aware that because these are usually using a higher acrylic content base, they're going to stick like crazy to your ceramic palette. You're going to have to really scrub out these wells. So after I've used the metallic for a while, I usually will take some water, my brush full of water, and I'll just kind of dance it around the outside to try to keep this all from setting as much. And sometimes that'll make it a little easier for me to clean out. If I still need the metallic, the part in the middle here is still the full strength, but all around the outside this water is kind of pooling and hopefully keeping it from drying so much. Definitely clean out your well palette right after you are done using your metallics. Otherwise, if they dry in there, good luck. Like, you're going to have to soak it for a long time. Probably going to have to use some cleansers to get it out of there, and definitely a green scrubby pad. So keep that in mind. The other thing is that if you're using a wet palette, metallics, when they are thinned, tend to fall out of solution really fast. And now that you know what metallics are, that should be pretty obvious to you. You're suspending a flake that's made of rock or metal in a watery base. So when you add more water and the paint breaks down a little bit and it loses its viscosity, the first thing all those flakes of stone and metal are going to do is sink. And that's why your metallics fall out of solution when you add too much water. That said, I've got that Army Painter paint right here. I find that I can add about 1 drop, 1 brush full, maybe even a little more. I'm just going to add this whole brush full. So that drop on the end, and I've still got some water in the brush. I find that I can add a decent amount of water before these paints start to go to absolutely crazy. So yeah, so as long as I've got a little bit of viscosity, I can pull my brush through, and it takes a while. You can see how it's taking a while to close up. So I'm able to thin it a little bit. I should be able to get a nice smooth coat on this way. I'm just going to paint over everybody with this Army Painter stuff. And thinned, it is a chance that it's not going to be as high coverage, just like with regular paint, but it also means that you're going to get a super smooth coat. So just like with regular paint, I can put on 2 thin coats of this metallic, and it'll be a nice, shiny, extremely even coat. You can really run into problems with some metallics if they've gotten thicker with age, or if you're putting it on thick and your paint is dried a little bit and you don't notice. It's very easy to build up texture with metallics if you're using it too thick and you overlap brush strokes or accidentally leave kind of a ridge of paint and you don't see it right away. Very, very easy to do that. So 2 thin coats is still a good approach for metallics. Just don't thin it as much as you might otherwise. On a wet palette, it's not that you can't use metallics on a wet palette, but I would use an extremely dry wet palette for metallics. You definitely don't want any of the water to be seeping up through your sponge onto your paper. You don't want to see any beading of moisture. You really want a drier sponge so you're not going to have any water leaching up into your paint, because then it's just going to turn it into a wash and it'll fall out of solution. So how much thinning a metallic paint will take will depend on the base. A very thick viscous base might take a fair bit of thinning, and it might be okay on a wet palette for a little while, but any metallics that are more fluid, they're probably going to fall apart pretty quick. And it really depends then per company, per the age of the paint. Metallics almost always thicken over time with age, noticeably. Okay, let's bust through some more factoids and then we're going to end up the video. Okay, so metallics, how does this work for shading? Because the base is a little bit different metallics seem to take washes or layering a little differently from each other. I've definitely worked with silver metallics that don't take washes or glazes very easily compared to others. And so this is going to be a matter of you kind of experimenting and figuring out, hey, what works with this technique if you want to use the washes and glazes techniques on your metallics. I'll likely be giving you guys examples in coming up videos of various ways to paint the shading on metallics. Okay, so what does this mean for highlighting? So obviously you're painting with flake instead of pigment, and flake particle size is much larger than pigment. So what this means in general is that you can't layer highlights. You can't get smooth blends with metallics. The only exception was the silicate flake metallics, which I found I could thin more, and so I could approximate layering with them. That said, if you're going up with small color transitions, you can usually get a pretty good effect with layering. It's not going to be perfect, but you can get pretty good. Just remember that if you are trying to layer, you probably want to use a mica metallic over an aluminum flake metallic. And the reason for that is the same thing we deal with regular paint. High coverage means that when you're trying to get something to go a little more translucent to create smooth gradient, a high coverage paint will fight you when you're trying to get smooth transitions from darker to lighter, and a paint that allows you to thin it a little more, that is a little more translucent, is going to just be a little bit more amenable to doing that stuff. Now, that's not to say that the aluminum flake paints, the high coverage ones, aren't good for highlighting. The way to do it is with texture. You can do all sorts of really cool microabrasion and scratch kind of markings with those high coverage paints, and it'll show up. So if you're working with texture to bring up your highlights, then that's a lot more forgiving when you're using those high coverage paints. Anyway, there's some tricks to that, and hopefully I'll be able to show you some of that in an upcoming video. One last note about the downside for aluminum flake, and that's about toxicity. I mentioned at the beginning that Reaper's decision to go mica was largely formed from wanting to be non-toxic. On the other hand, the aluminum flake situation is a little more interesting. So if we look at some of these bottles, we see some, not necessarily warnings. The ProAct rule has the conforms to the ASTMD. So what this is it means that the product has been tested and not found to cause any extremely bad outcomes. For example, cancer or, things like that. It's not going to burn your eyes if it gets in your eyes. It's not going to burn your skin if it gets on your skin. However, it doesn't mean that you won't have reactions to it. So, conforms to ASTMD, and it also has chemicals here listed. And it does say down here, may produce an allergic reaction. So, sure, it won't cause any really nasty side effects, but ASTMD, etc., does not mean that it won't cause anything. It does not mean non-toxic. It does not mean inert. So, if you're a brush licker, then probably you want to kind of take notice just because, do you really need to be swallowing metal? Probably not. If you swallow rocks, you probably just have them move through. But the metal, a little dicey there, folks. So I've always considered that somewhat of a downside. If you don't have small children in the house and you're not a brush licker, it's not a downside at all. I mean, that's me, right? I don't have kids and I don't lick my brush. So for me, I can use these and I'm not really concerned. There's another one in here, another interesting, where is it? I had another different, oh yeah. So the Model Air has a different one, EN71. And what that one means is that they tested it to make sure it doesn't have stuff in it like cadmium, mercury, lead, tin, essentially the known to be toxic metals. Now, aluminum is not one of those, but it's still metal. So yeah, EN73, it's been tested, it's been found not to have highly toxic substances, but it certainly doesn't mean you're not going to have a reaction to it. Just be cautious, folks, that's all I ask. All right, so what we'll be doing in the coming months is I'm going to be doing some actual demo videos for you on shading and highlighting metallics. There are a couple different ways that people do it, a couple different styles out there. There's probably more than a couple, if we're honest. But I'll be at least doing 1 or 2 videos about how to actually work with this stuff. And I'll try to use different types, different brands, so that you guys can see which ones are best for what, right? Okay, that said, this has gone on long enough. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll be back at you soon. This is Anne, signing off.